Happy Friday to everyone out there. This is Brandon from Comics Kings. Welcome back to the kingdom, you guys. I am super excited for today's episode. Not only is it the 6-month anniversary of Creators Corner, 6 months, 19 episodes. Today we're sitting down with one of my absolute favorite people ever in comic books, the creator of one of my favorite characters, Nightwing, Nova, Blade, Bullseye. Right, you guys know I'm a huge Daredevil fan. Guys, let's all give a nice warm welcome to Marv Wolfman. Marv, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing fine. Your introduction music is like wow dramatic.
Yeah, I wanted to do a little Game of Thrones thing, so I'm a huge fan of that. This show is called Comics King, so I figured, you know what? Let me just merge the two enough to where it's not copyrighted, and one of my good friends made it. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm glad you enjoyed it, man.
Good job.
Thank you. So, quick question: what actually got you into comic books?
Um, I think like everyone else, one way or another, you find it first. I was watching the Superman TV show for the very first time back in 1951, 52, whatever year it was on. And at the end, it said it was based on a comic book, and walked to the corner where I had a newsstand and bought my first comic book because of the TV show. I had never seen it before. I never heard of it before. And it was pretty amazing for a young kid to see that.
100%. I think my first experience was with my grandmother. I love Star Wars, so she's like, "Oh, you might like comic books," and she gave me her uncle's old collection, or my uncle's old collection, and I read Captain Marvel 34 with first Nitro, Death of Captain Marvel, and I fell in love ever since and bought my first comic book, and now we're here to where I'm doing this show. Part of today's discussion, I wanted to talk about how you're doing event writing, right? So what was, to start, your biggest event book, Crisis on Infinite Earths with DC Comics? What was the whole inspiration, what soared that project?
Crisis. It's one of those things where I felt, and a lot of readers felt, people like who are Marvel fans but not DC fans, that the DC universe with its multiverse, a term that we're familiar with now but not back then, was too confusing, and they wouldn't even give DC a try. So my thought was, let's simplify it. Let's make it possible for people to realize how good the DC characters were. And I proposed Crisis, and they went for it. And then I spent a couple of years putting it together because it's a very, very complex story, and with lots of over 400 characters in it. And it's not something that you could rush out. Also, it was something vitally important to DC, that it had to be the best it could be. If we failed with that, the readers would just go, I guess DC isn't good or something. But what happened was people gave us a try, and then they started to buy other DCs, and they learned how good the characters were.
Right. And of course, you and George Perez, one of my favorite duos in comic books. How did you guys really get together? You were obviously familiar with him with Teen Titans. Was he the artist that DC selected? Did you select him? How did you choose who was on the creative team for that?
Well, George and I worked together at Marvel. He drew several stories that I wrote. So it was pretty clear and evident that he'd be a good guy to do Teen Titans. And I asked him, and he was more than willing. He liked the idea. He wanted to give it a try. And once we were doing that, when I finally came up with the idea for Crisis, George wasn't going to draw it at first. He was going to write and draw his own book. And but every time we get together for a Titans meeting, he'd ask how Crisis was coming, and I'd tell him, and finally he said, "Do you have an artist for it?" And I said, "Not yet. We're waiting until the scripts are ready." And he said, "I want to do it. I got to do it." And he was the absolute best and the only person I think could have done it well.
Right. He's probably my favorite artist today. I started reading him first on X-Men, and then Avengers, and then I made my way over to Teen Titans, and then Crisis. That was kind of my reading order. with George. How did you choose kind of which characters to have more importance in the story versus, or which characters would die versus those who would stay and enjoy their time after the events?
The idea was to introduce readers to the vast number of characters DC had. Again, most of the people were Marvel readers who had never given DC a try, and when you said DC to them, they would go Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and that's the only characters they knew from DC. And so the idea was to play up the secondary characters, the other heroes that DC had, to show readers how vast and how good they were. So it was a matter of, if you look at the Crisis, no major character for the most part appears in the first 4 or 5 episodes, 4 or 5 issues. It's all the secondary characters.
Right.
And that was on purpose. And then we finally we bring in Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman halfway through the series. And that allowed, I think, the readers to slowly understand the DC universe by not giving them what they were expecting.
100%. That's definitely a great way to do that. Do you think DC has kind of taken that inspiration over the years with projects such as New 52 and Rebirth, with everything that Crisis influenced?
I'm sorry, I couldn't make out the question.
Do you think that DC kind of uses the influence of Crisis and reintroducing characters whenever they relaunch, such as with the New 52 and Rebirth?
Well, I think when Crisis was first proposed to them, a lot of the people in charge didn't think it would sell that well. They didn't think the idea would have worked. I, of course, totally disagreed. And when the sales came in, and the sales were incredibly good, the best-selling books DC had in decades, once you have a hit, which indicates to them this type of book, this type of concentration on continuity and such, was successful and something the readers wanted, obviously they decided to continue doing that. I had nothing to do with any of the others except for the original.
Right, 100%. How is this kind of a story, this level of event where there are obviously much higher stakes, how does that differ from projects such as like Tomb of Dracula, Daredevil, that are a little niche based, and when you're introducing characters rather than building events?
Again, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but every book is different. It doesn't matter what it is, and I've done every sort of book out there. In my early days, I was doing some of DC's romance comics. I did Uncle Scrooge and Mickey Mouse for Disney. I did, all the Marvel characters and the DC characters. So you concentrate on each one and make them what those characters should be. You don't even think about the others. So when I'm writing Dracula, no place in my mind am I thinking of Teen Titans or something of that sort. In fact, when I'm writing Night Force, which is a horror book that DC published, I'm not thinking of Titans. I'm just concentrating on the characters as they are and trying to make a good story based on that. So I don't know. Did I answer your question? I'm not quite sure what it was.
So the question was, how does writing events differ from writing books that just introduce new characters?
No, I did understand it. It was, they're different. Every job that a writer gets is going to be slightly different, and you just have to adapt. I don't know what the difference is between writing an event and writing a standard issue of something, because to me, if I'm writing an event book, I have to make it the best event book it can be. And then when you switch over to, say, introducing brand new characters, as we did in the Titans, you're worrying about making those characters work and make, when you're introducing so many new ones like Raven and Starfire and Cyborg and Trigon and Deathstroke and all of those, you want the readers who are seeing these characters now for the very first time to really care for them. But it's the same job. It's the same, you're approaching it the same way as you do a single issue book or a character, introducing a new character. You make it clear, you make the readers understand who the characters are, and you come up with a storyline that makes them want to read it and then continue reading it.
Right. So what would you say is like the biggest challenge with Crisis? Was it finding an artist, or was it building the stakes?
Now, once we had George, the thing to do was to make sure that all 400 of those characters that appeared in the Crisis were written correctly, making sure Superman sounded like Superman and Batman like Batman, Green Arrow and Green Lantern and all the others had to sound correct, so that the readers, the brand new readers to Crisis and therefore DC, would come out of reading Crisis understanding all the characters at DC. Right. Well, the hardest thing was making sure it was on character.
Right. And how do you really go about making characters that do not really appear in the DC universe have that appearance to new readers, that they're written quote unquote correctly?
What I try to do when I'm writing is get into the head of the character. So I'm just, to me, I hear the voices of each character in my head and let them come out through my fingers on the typewriter. I'm just trying to take those characters and fully understand who they are, so that and then find a way to use them that makes the readers understand who the characters are.
100%. And I really do like this question from the chat from one of my co-hosts of the channel. How do you go about selecting who survived Crisis? Because I know Barry died, Supergirl died, and a few other people.
In fact, not that many characters did die. Billions of trillions of people died, but they, just as worlds were destroyed. But in terms of the actual superheroes, very few characters did. What we needed to do was to make sure that the readers knew that this was something special. So when you surprise the readers and you kill Supergirl, they realize DC is not the old staid company that it used to be, but they're daring to try different things. They're daring to push forward, and you want to use characters that the readers will empathize with and care about. So, because the job is making DC look new and fresh and daring and interesting to readers who had not given it a try before.
100%. Which character do you think was like the most difficult to write in DC?
In Crisis?
In Crisis.
The character most difficult? Probably some of the new ones like Pariah and Harbinger and the Monitor, because they were taking on a major plot points, and really had to make sure that they were interesting rather than just be exposition. So introducing a new character when you're already writing 400 other characters is not easy.
Right. And how many years did it take you to go back and research all 400 characters? When did you pitch the original idea to DC?
It took a couple of years. I would say that on the top, right off the top, I knew virtually every DC character. When I was an intern at DC as a kid, because I went to the High School of Art and Design, so I got to intern at DC for a little bit. During my lunch break, I would sit in the DC library and read all the old comics. So I actually knew most of them. We did hire somebody to research it, but it turned out that I didn't need it for Crisis, and instead we used all of that on history, on the DC Who's Who. So that the reference that the person we hired created for us was vital to the Who's Who, but wasn't as necessary on Crisis. But we didn't know that in the beginning. But fortunately, doing Who's Who, we were able to use all of his reference.
Right. Perfect. And what got you? You said you interned in DC. What got you to switch over from Marvel to DC to do New Teen Titans?
Well, I wasn't Teen Titans. I hadn't even proposed that yet. I proposed that a couple months after I came to DC. I didn't. I didn't necessarily agree with the person in charge at Marvel, so I wanted to move on.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And what was the biggest inspiration behind New Teen Titans introducing all of these new characters?
I wanted to do a book that I created, and with George, as it turned out. When I first proposed it, obviously there wasn't even an artist. It was just my thoughts of what I'd like to do. And then once George came in, it became a totally different thing because he's so good at what he does. I think that's it.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna keep going on that. My apologies about that. So
my hearing isn't great, so I may miss something.
No worries at all. So going over characters such as Deathstroke. Talk about his first appearance for us a little bit and how he got started.
I was trying to come up with a villain for Titans. At the same time, I was coming up with the Titans because, in point of fact, it's the Deathstroke's son is in the first issue, so that meant Deathstroke was already created as well because the story was about his son and therefore him coming into the situation. What you try to do with a villain is come up with a character who's a little bit different from anybody else because we've been doing comics now for 80 years, and it's hard to come up with something new. And I felt I had a take with Deathstroke that was going to be very different than the standard villain who was, I'm going to rob a bank or I'm going to do that. He's not interested in any of that stuff. Then the next step is I want to make this a real character. I just don't want him to be a throwaway character. So he has an entire family. He has an ex-wife. He has 2 sons. He has his best friend who was sort of his manager with Wintergreen. We enriched his personal life in ways that you just never saw with villains before in comics. Usually the villain is just doing his crime. Here he had an entire family and an entire history and a background that had a lot more to do with making him a real person than just, we'll throw in a mercenary.
Right, 100%. And do you think that's why he's still important today? Today he's probably DC's biggest vigilante or biggest villain in there today. Probably that has their own ongoing series. Do you think that's like a big reason why is his relationship with his daughter, his relationship with his son that are still being used today?
Yeah, you don't see that even today with a lot of villains where they have an entire family set up and a history and a what's the word? Just a life outside of being a criminal. And in many ways, he could have been a superhero if he wasn't corrupt. Because we spend all that time often with the heroes. Sometimes we give the heroes a family. I mean, not that often. I think Deathstroke has more of a family than most other superheroes do, let alone villains.
Right.
And I do think that helped make him more interesting to the readers, and that's why he's still around today. On top of that, then you add in what George did with the costume, and it's just incredible.
Right. No, that's easily one of the best costumes. The orange really just makes him stand out. I think that's probably like you just see him coming no matter where he is. That even with my color blindness, I still see him. So what would you say is the biggest difference to those people who have seen him on TV shows, in movies, but have not read him in the comics? what is the biggest difference between the on-screen presence and what was created in the comic book?
I don't worry about what they do in on TV or the movies. That's not my job. Fortunately, I like most of what they did, but it's very possible I could have not liked it. Um, so I only really worry about the comics. I'm writing a comic, and I created Deathstroke for the comics in 1980, and all of everything that's happened with him since occurred many, many years after I created him. And I also wrote about 80, 90 issues of the Deathstroke comic book, let alone his appearances elsewhere. So, he's a good character. He really is a good character because we spent the time to make him a person as opposed to just a criminal.
100%. And then later on in Titans, you did introduce Nightwing, which was a new status quo for Dick Grayson. A question here saying, how hard was it to sell that evolution to DC of Nightwing?
Well, what happened with Dick Grayson is that the Batman editors wanted Robin back in the Batman book. He'd been out of the book for a number of years, and they really felt that it should be Batman and Robin again. I didn't want to lose the character. He was my touchstone character for the book, and he was vital to the book. So I made a suggestion: why don't you keep Robin? Let me keep Dick Grayson. You don't really care about Dick. You want Batman and Robin. So come up with your own character with that. Make it real special. You can really get a lot of publicity because this has never been done before, with a young sidekick becomes a hero on his own. But we've been leading up to that. Excuse me. We've been leading up to that anyway, making Dick older over the course of years. So it was only a matter of time before he left Batman anyway.
Right. And what was the biggest influence for the whole Nightwing name?
I didn't even want to use Nightwing as a name because Nightwing's a character that appeared in Superman, a fellow Kryptonian. But it had been years, it had been decades, and Tony Tolan, who's a colorist at DC at the time, kept suggesting, why don't you use Nightwing? Because the name fit the character. Tony's wife actually was the colorist for Titans. So, but I kept saying no because of the Superman connection. But in point of fact, there was no better name. And once that was cleared, just used it because it was the best name possible. And the way I explained it was that this was Dick came up with the name because it reflected not only Batman, the Nightwing type image, but also Superman. So in honor of the people who helped him the most, Superman and Batman, he's using that name.
Right. Earlier in the show, you talked about how you were able to put yourself through the heads of certain characters. For a character like Dick Grayson, that to me seems especially important, being his legacy and what he holds in comics. What do you think sets Dick Grayson apart from most other characters in the DC universe?
Think about Batman. He became Batman because his parents were murdered, and he went for decades filled with anger, filled with this desire to seek retribution on criminals so that nobody else do this. But it was all coming out of anger and the need for revenge and the need to capture these people. Now, look at Dick Grayson. His parents get killed, and Batman finds the killer immediately. There's no grieving. I mean, there's the grieving of a lost parent, but the killer is captured. He's incarcerated. There's no anger building, and instead, what Dick took out of it was he was helped. The superhero came down and helped him. Now he wants to help others because this is what he learned. He's not an angry person, and Batman's an angry person because it took him decades to find the killer of his parents. And Dick is not. Dick is somebody who wants to help others. So he has a very upbeat attitude, and he's not a negative person at all.
100%. To me, when I look at Dick Grayson, I think of him as probably the best leader in DC Comics, and that's one of the things that I'm really, really enjoying in the Titans show and how they're showcasing his leadership skills, where they could very easily just put him in Gotham and he could turn into Batman. Later on, he went out to Bloodhaven. What do you think of Nightwing's legacy after Titans, after Teen Titans?
I have made it a practice all my career never to read anything that I've come up with once I'm off it. I hate to say I just never read any of those.
Got you. Which character which character did you have the most difficulty creating out of the whole Titans cast?
Gee, I don't know. Yeah, there are characters that come very fast. There are characters that are very slow, but I would think the hardest to get a grasp on was probably Raven, because she has the most depth. She's the most interesting of all the characters because of her life and all of her background. So to make her work, even though she's sort of demonically possessed in some fashion, that took a lot of work, because if you handled it wrong, she'd come off as a totally different character and totally wrong character.
100%. So if you can speak on Raven a little bit, because I know there are a lot of people here in the chat that have not really had much introduction to Raven, or she hasn't really been spotlighted as much in today's comics. If you can talk about her origin story a little bit for everyone.
Well, Raven's the daughter of a demon, frankly, and it's a very, very complex origin. It's much easier, I think, for somebody to go online and find it than me to have to explain it. But she is the daughter of a demon, but she was raised sort of in a fairly cultish type of extra-dimensional world called Azarath. And she is the most troubled of all the characters, because she has to constantly fight the evil that's inside her. And if she lets go, she could probably destroy the planet. 100%. She is that powerful.
Yes, and that's often something that's overlooked, is how much that Raven has to endure. Now, I know you're no stranger to talking about kind of demons and vampires, because you created probably one of the most famous one of it, Blade. Blade being a character created in 1972. If you can talk about that origin and his appearance, his creation for the character that he is, or that for what he was in Tomb of Dracula.
Well, I've always said that there were only two characters in all the characters I created that came to me in like 1 second, and Blade was one of them. I have no idea where he came from. It just emerged full-blown. Everything. I knew everything about him instantly, and he was a really solid character. Because I did not watch horror movies, and I had never seen a Dracula movie at all. I was allowed to sort of come up with my own mythos. The only Dracula information I had was from the original novel. But as I say, I had never seen any of the movies. So I was able to do my version of Bram Stoker as opposed to, Hammer Films version. I'm not adapting somebody else's work. I'm doing my own. And I got to, because I don't have a lot of knowledge about the vampire movies, I was able to create my own approach to it.
I'm so happy you said that, because whenever people ask me what my favorite horror movie is, I don't tell them, because I don't have a favorite. I'll say I'll look at them. I'll say, does Alien count or does Jaws count? Because those are the only two that I've ever watched. What was your favorite issue or story arc written in the Tomb of Dracula series?
I'd say the last 3 years with his wife, the satanic cult, his son, and it was an entire story about this vampire being touched by humanity and fighting it every way he could.
Perfect. I'm not as familiar with Tomb of Dracula as I am with Nova projects such as Nova, Bullseye. So let's actually talk about Bullseye for a little bit. Would you say that he's similar to Deathstroke? Did you get any inspiration from Bullseye in Deathstroke at all?
No, I had never thought about Bullseye at all while I was doing Deathstroke. Deathstroke was created to be able to fight Daredevil in a way that had not been done before. Because Daredevil had radar senses and was able to pick up motion, he usually, if you were coming at him, he'd know it before you'd be seen.
Right.
He would, and Bullseye was able to attack from a distance. He could throw one of his, a knife or something, and before Daredevil could react to it, because a knife is very small and it takes a while for you to make it work in his head, it would hit him. So no, there's no similarity whatsoever. Deathstroke's a mercenary who Bullseye is a thief. He's a criminal.
Right. Another amazing question from the chat. Can you talk about the sort of yin and yang of Starfire and Raven? They seem to counter each other or counterbalance each other in a beautiful symbolic way.
What's the question?
The question is, can you talk about the yin and yang of Starfire and Raven? And how they balance each other?
All the characters in the Titans are reverse mirror images of the other characters. You have Raven, who's a pacifist and is not allowed to show emotion, or the demons inside her could burst free. On the other hand, Starfire is pure emotion, and she was a warrior, the exact opposite of a pacifist. She is pure emotion, and Raven cannot have emotion. So all the characters were created to play off each other, that there'd be similarities and there'd be differences, but that allows you to show the differences between the characters and really make the stories and the characters far more interesting than if they were all just cookie cutter characters.
100%. And what other characters mirrored each other that you just mentioned?
You look at, those two characters are also part of Wonder Girl, where Wonder Girl comes from a cultish group of Amazons, essentially a tribe of Amazons. Starfire. No, let me think for a second. Yeah, Wonder Girl comes from there, but it's also a group of women who believe in peace. So again, you have that part that's the same as Raven, the need for peace, but you have the other part that she's a warrior. And with Starfire, it's the same sort of thing, where Wonder Girl is the one who keeps sort of the middle ground. She does not let her emotions take over, and Raven and Starfire, of course, does. You have Dick Grayson, who is more of a leader, and then you have Cyborg, who is probably a lot smarter,
right,
and a much better fighter than Dick. So there are similarities and there are differences with each one of the characters. I didn't explain it well, but when I created it, they were all intentionally created to have similarities and differences, that so the characters could react off each other.
100%, man. Now, what has been your experience so far? Because I know you've been doing a lot for the Titans. Do you have a lot of influence on that show, or are you there to help organize some of the characters? What is your role right now with the TV show?
I don't have a role on the TV show. I watch it.
You
I
watch?
enjoy it. No, this is this. I do the comics. I do other things. I write video games. I write that, but I don't work on TV.
So, are you currently writing anything or doing any projects?
I'm currently working on two video game projects, but I'm not allowed to talk about them. I'm always doing something. In this case, it's video games.
And what is the biggest difference between kind of writing a video game and writing a comic book? Because I've never really talked to anyone who's written video games before.
I've written about a dozen over the years, maybe a few more than that. The purpose of a video game is to engage the player, and you become proactive. You are part of the story because you make the decisions of how the characters are going one way or the other. Whereas a comic, you can't change anything in the comic. You're reading a finished story, and it is a story by itself, and you have to just read it. You are not participating in it. You can't change it. You can't decide a character should do the X instead of Y. You are a reader, and you're going along with it, as opposed to a video game where you are controlling the narrative, and depending on how you fight, you can win or lose. And if you die, you get reborn, but still, those are the basic differences to start with. Also, the purpose of a video game is to engage the player in a game, whereas the purpose of a comic, like all books, is to make you sit down and think about it, read it, think about it, and keep going over the book if you want, keep going over the characters if you want, and the story.
Right, 100%. I'm not really a big video game. I used to be a big video game person, but unfortunately, when you do play video games, that takes away from reading comic books, from doing this. So this is always taking up a whole lot of my time, and my reading is a lot right now. So I haven't really touched a video game in the better part of 5-6 years. So
well, there's a lot of good ones.
Yeah, comics or video games. So going back to Marvel, let's talk about Nova for a second, because I know that he is rumored to be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe soon. Was he like a new concept? What was the biggest inspiration of bringing him into the Marvel Universe?
I don't work at Marvel. I don't know. I don't know what the movie people are doing.
Right, but what was the inspiration for creating him?
Back then, in those days, everybody created different characters, and my feeling was that Marvel was starting to get a little bit dark. The reality, the way comics were changing, it was just starting to get very dark for me, and I was writing too much Dracula, which obviously was a very dark book, but that was also written for a more adult audience. What I wanted to do is create a character that would sort of bring back the old Marvel, more of a fun, younger character that would return, that would make you think of the days of the early Spider-Mans, which was so different from what Spider-Man had become later on. Again, Spider-Man became darker, Superman, Batman, all of those characters sort of took on a little dark side, and I wanted to do something that the youngest Marvel readers could enjoy, right. And that's why I created Nova, and why I created those, specifically the type of villain he ran which were all over the top type of characters.
Why do you think those kinds of characters did enter their dark side, or why did they get darker?
The whole world has. I think that's a natural evolution. People, the readers of comics, may have started when they were 6 or 7 or 8 years old, but once they're reaching 14 or 15, if the comics were still written the way they were, they would lose interest quickly. If you're 8 and you're reading about a character or a storyline meant for a 10-year-old, maybe that's okay. But when you're now 15, you're really not interested in reading a little kid's comic anymore. So you start writing it darker, you start writing it more with more depth and a lot of other things. And of course, the writers want to write stuff that has more emotion in it.
Right. Another great question from the chat. What made you decide to have Wally West abandon his mantle of Kid Flash entirely as opposed to creating his own mantle like Dick Grayson?
I didn't hear the second half of that, but let me say, my feeling was I really like Wally, but he should not be in a group book. What I usually say is the Titans are in the Titans Tower and they're all sitting there talking, and suddenly they get a signal that there's a crime happening in Times Square. If you're playing these characters realistically, before Dick Grayson, Robin could stand up, Kid Flash should have been able to run there, put down the villain who couldn't see him coming. He just knocks him out with 2,000 punches, in a half a second, and then he comes back. He's too powerful for a group. The rest of the group is redundant. Because Wally should be able to defeat the villain before they can even move or before they can do anything. So I just wanted him out of the book. He's the wrong fit if you're thinking about the characters realistically. In the old days, before in the original run of Titans, Kid Flash usually would, there's a crime, they'd all run out together, and then you cut to the scene where they all get to the crime and they were all coming in at the same exact time, even Wally. But you didn't think about it because you were young and the books were aimed at a young kid and you weren't thinking of those things. But if you start to think about those things and the readership is older, they can accept the fact that it makes no sense to have a character like Wally in a group book like the Titans. He's much better on his own.
Right. And I really like that about Wally is he doesn't really depend on anybody. He's more of an independent person. I look at Barry, who is just surrounded and always needs somebody to be there for him. And I actually enjoy Wally as saying he's the better Flash. Wally is another one of my personal favorites. Another great question from the chat from Wesley. Who are some of Marv's favorite artists that he has worked with?
Well,
George,
if I start naming them, I will leave out 90% of them because I've worked with virtually everybody. So let me just say the two that everyone would expect, and they're brilliant, is Gene Colan and George Perez. They're on two of my favorite books. So I don't have to remember who else I work with.
100%. Personally, everyone knows what I would say. I would easily say George. But Marv, I do want to thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. You guys, this has been the 6-month anniversary of Creators Corner, which is really exciting to me. The next guest that we are going to have on the show will be December 4th. That's going to be J.M. Dematius. I don't know how to pronounce it. I forgot how to pronounce it.
Mark Dematis.
Mark Dematis. And we're going to be talking about Kraven's Last Hunt. We're going to be talking about Ben Reilly Spider-Man coming out in January. I'm excited for that. Marv, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
Happy Friday, you guys. Take care. Make sure you guys drop a like, drop a subscription if you guys have not already. Happy Friday, and look for our review of Hawkeye by Matt Fraction and David Aja. It's going to be dropping tomorrow at 1 o'clock sharp. So stay tuned for that. Take care, you guys.